I'm now going to introduce Chris Ruen, who's an author from Brooklyn. His essays and criticisms have appeared in the New York Times, Slate, the New York Press, and Stereo Gum. He's a former contributing editor for Cooler magazine and has covered music culture for Tiny Mixtapes based in Minneapolis. He has written a book, which is sort of the reason why he's here today, called Freeloading: How Our Insatiable Appetite for Free Content is Starving Creativity, which was published last year by OR Books in the US and in Canada. And the book will be published in Australia and New Zealand by Scribe Publications this coming March, which would mean it would be out this coming March, right? Yeah, okay. This currently existing March in the singularity, yes. Okay. We have a couple of plugs for the book. One from David Byrne, a wonderful book that catches an encouraging shift in the zeitgeist, and from the Sydney Sun Herald, a deeply moral and passionate book. I'm glad that he's here today and was able to join us. And so I will give you Chris Ruen.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Forgive me for kicking it old school, as it were, with the analog paper for my speech today. And I'd like to thank Graham Henderson and everybody at CMW for having me up from my home in Brooklyn, that now world-renowned, world-famous utopia of the creative class, where video artists and artisanal food trucks roam free like gazelles on the plains of Africa. So as Chris mentioned, I wrote a book, Freeloading, and in some ways, I'm not sure how I fit in to gatherings like this, because I'm not of the music industry. I never worked for the music industry. I'm not a professional musician, like as David is. And really, I see myself as, you know, in some ways like a struggling young musician, except in the publishing field. I'm just a writer who happens to be a lifelong music fan, independently trying to sort this issue out, an issue that's bedeviled us for well over a decade now. And I'm hoping to engage some new thoughts, some new discussion, and to stir the pot a bit, and hopefully make some positive contribution. Anyway, my entry into this debate was organic and quite personal. About 3 years ago, I was working at a cafe in Brooklyn, as one would expect of a young writer living in Brooklyn. And it happened to be a cafe where lots of well-known musicians were regulars. They had rehearsal spaces or just lived in the neighborhood. So TV on the radio, The Hold Steady, MGMT, Vampire Weekend, Yesayer, Blonde Redhead, you know, a number of these bands and musicians were just around. And I got to know some of the artists from these bands, and I was surprised to find out how little money they seemed to be making. And it really surprised me, because I was really coming at music culture from the perspective of a fan who, I think like a lot of fans, when you see someone getting a lot of coverage, selling out venues, you assume, oh, they must be making a lot of money. They must be, you know, doing great. They're successful. And I found that all was not as it appeared on the mediated surface. And I started to think and reevaluate my own generation. I was a freshman in college the year Napster peaked at 70 million users worldwide. And, you know, I freeloaded music, as I call it, or pirated music, as did all of my friends. And we pirated all the music that we could. We never asked questions about justification. We were told that free music represented the future, and that future would be better for up-and-coming artists. We were told that the only people piracy hurt were those who didn't need money anyway. They were rich artists and rich corporate labels who, quote, didn't understand technology. But my immediate experience in Brooklyn suddenly demonstrated the fallacy that was going on. And once I was closer to the creative community, I saw that artists, as much as it's in some ways fun and inviting to put them on a pedestal as, you know, some inhuman vessels of, you know, some sacred spirit, which in some cases they are, at the end of the day, they are struggling, working people, and that very few amass great wealth, and very few much less a teacher's salary. So why didn't musicians deserve, at the very least, respect for their own choice of how to distribute their work? This really troubled me at the time, and I started studying it further, and you know, started writing about it. And what really struck home with me was the fact that the artist voice and the artist in general, in the process of the piracy wars playing out, had really been left out of the debate. It was a voice that wasn't heard very much. Now, after the Napster controversy, Jonathan Taplin predicted that, okay, Lars Ulrich, he's very easy to portray as some out-of-touch old guy, but, he predicted, when Ray Charles or Aretha Franklin raises their voice about piracy, you know, people are going to view this in a different way. Of course, we all know that that never happened. After Metallica was tarred and feathered, a culture of fear developed where artists were, you know, arguably afraid to stick their necks out, and that created a vacuum in the debate. And within that vacuum, where artists would be advocating for themselves and making it clear to fans what side they were on, major labels were left alone to defend artists' rights and were easily portrayed as self-serving by those who wanted the issue to be about corporate control of culture rather than the real issue, which is establishing basic fairness in the marketplace of creativity in the internet age. In the process, you know, people would beat up on labels while saying that piracy actually helped artists in some magical fashion. A basic fact wasn't communicated to fans. And the basic fact is that artists choose to partner with record labels. If they didn't, record labels wouldn't exist. Now, to anyone in the industry, this is a fact so obvious, perhaps it doesn't seem worth mentioning. You know, it is an incredibly, incredibly obvious point. But, as it so happens, that fact was something fans of my generation, and arguably of, you know, the generation that's following me, weren't forced to confront as they rationalized away piracy. That, you know, they weren't forced to confront the reality that by hurting the label the artist has chosen to partner with, the artist is being hurt as well, and their opportunities for the future are being hurt. So, in my personal experience, when you recognize the artist in these debates and place them at its center, not just in rhetoric, but in reality, these issues become simplified in the mind of the customer or the consumer. Once they recognize that the music they are enjoying wasn't destined to be made, it was made by a person or people of flesh and blood who, in all likelihood, are broke, a lot of the heady digital fanaticism seems to fade away. The question as to whether or not artists deserve some basic fairness from the marketplace becomes rather uncontroversial. Stray from the working reality of artists, and it becomes just another battle from the perspective of fans between two entrenched industries. And that's not exactly something music fans are going to invest themselves in, not that kind of a debate. So by language and concepts that we all use in this debate, we can make a more resonant argument and turn the page forward, one hopes, to something that resembles resolution of these issues. And that's the reason I suggest freeloading is a better word, literally and figuratively, than piracy or file sharing. Free downloading, as in free plus downloading, but also the dictionary definition of freeloading, which is taking advantage of others' generosity without offering anything in return. That term acknowledges the creator and a fan's relationship to that creator. And I also think it's important that we find more simple and yet accurate ways also of talking about copyright. Copyright does have a very long and complex history, and I'm sure we can all find areas of disagreement in regards to how it should or should not be implemented. I'm sure we all have different thresholds for which we may think copyright can go too far. But when communicating to the public and also to artists who, in many cases, are just as confused as anyone on these issues, I suggest a simplified explanation of what copyright means in practical terms. It's the right not to be ripped off. A few months ago, Beach House, the band from Baltimore, they were approached by an advertising company in the UK who wanted to use one of their songs, and Beach House was not comfortable with using their music for an advertisement, so they said no. And very soon after, the advertisement appeared with a song that sounded eerily similar to the very song that this advertising company was attempting to license. And I was interested to read in Pitchfork, the music blog, a story about this where they talked about Beach House being ripped off. Now, I just think it's an interesting thing to note that, at least in my experience as being a pretty obsessive follower of music culture, I don't think I've ever seen a prominent music blog address freeloading with the same language. And it's just interesting because essentially the same thing is going on. People are getting ripped off. And that's why placing this spotlight today on brand-sponsored piracy is so important. It makes it painfully obvious that artists continue to be ripped off by some of the most powerful companies in the world. So, you know, how heinous is this, as detailed in David's presentation? And what is the argument for allowing websites and ad networks, not to mention search engines and ISPs, to go on profiting, as they have for many years now, on the back of working artists without offering them anything in return? It's important in these debates to look for distinctions, because people have a tendency to conflate the internet revolution with piracy and make it seem as though in order to embrace technology, you also have to accept piracy. This is a fallacy. And Dropbox, for example, has figured out a way to offer cloud storage without running terribly afoul of rights holders. RapidShare may not be perfect, but they are certainly providing a strong example that to be seen as a legitimate service means accepting certain rules of the road. And keeping these examples of legitimate services in mind, you know, I think we should look at these storage lockers, torrent trackers, and indexes that show themselves to be dedicated to ripping off artists, and we should accept them for what they are. They are commercial black markets. Today, David demonstrated the money trail that funds mass freeloading, and it seems clear that Google is unwilling to voluntarily address the problem. In their failure to effectively downgrade known pirate sites in their search results as they promised recently they would. It seems to me that we know what the problem is. Even Google's UK compliance manager, Theo Bertram, admitted last summer that the most effective form of copyright enforcement, quote, is to go after the money, to remove the financial underpinnings, the advertising, the payment processes from foreign sites that knowingly distribute illegitimate content, as reported by Digital Music News. Google's own chief economist, Hal Varian, writes in his book, this is something that the Tricordist reported on, the book is Information Rules. So Google's own chief economist talked about bitleggers. You know, basically this is the same group of people, these black markets that we're talking about today. And he also has this interesting quote: digital piracy can't be eliminated any more than any other kind of illegal activity, but it can be kept under control. All that is required is the political will to enforce intellectual property rights. And, you know, let's add something else into this formula here, or you know, what's happening. And remember that when Mega Upload was shut down, there was a domino effect, and a pretty serious one. And some of the sites that closed down in the aftermath cited the shifting legal terrain. So enforcement, you know, people are paying attention, and if it's shown that enforcement has consequences, the incentives change, and you know, the business models or the prospect for profits changes for these companies. So if copyright enforcement is to be meaningful, the commercial black markets we discussed today, they must be dealt with one way or another. And I would argue that known black markets deserve to be placed on black lists. SOPA, Stop Online Piracy Act, so controversial. You know, I had problems with SOPA. There are some cases where I think it went too far, but it did provide a model for dealing with this problem. in regards to establishing some sort of blacklist for black markets. SOPA included a concrete mechanism for identifying foreign-based black market sites, then notifying advertising networks and payment processors to stop doing business with them. This would have established clear rules of the road for US-based internet commerce moving forward, and it would have marginalized unlicensed digital distributors in the process, while giving legitimate digital content markets a fair chance to develop and compete, which is really what we're trying to push for today. So, one thing I didn't like about SOPA was the private right to action, and I would say, for all the fears that people had about that legislation or any kind of blacklist legislation, if it is coming from the government, leave it to the Justice Department to bring evidence against these sites with damaging political consequences dealt to the executive branch if overreach does occur. And also I would really say that it's important for us to tackle SOPA and the aftermath and the entire context of that law and how it was treated head on. We shouldn't be afraid of talking about it. When you really look at what happened with the protest and the blackout, effectively millions of internet users roused themselves from sleep one morning, then turned on their computer screens and smartphones as per usual. They were greeted by blacked out logos and startling warnings about a hitherto unknown law called SOPA, warned by trusted internet brands that the anti-piracy, anti-counterfeiting law would imperil their favorite sites, stifle innovation, censor, and even break the internet. These users filled out form petitions and called lawmakers, parroting spoon-fed talking points. As it turns out, I would argue, SOPA wasn't the distillation of pure evil it was made out to be, nor was the successful blackout protest an open and shut case of grassroots goodness as it was reported to be. The SOPA blackout was in fact a textbook example of how to prey on the biases of an uneducated public, incite them with misinformation, and corral the resulting mob for one's own devices. Fight the Future, a 501c4 group that was founded the same month SOPA was introduced in Congress, proposed the blackout idea, developed its infrastructure, and organized with Reddit, Google, and other tech industry stakeholders, beginning with a meeting at Mozilla headquarters on November 9th, 2011. And I have a lot of details about how this all played out in my book. The Media Democracy Fund. And so it's a 501c4, and then they got an additional $700,000 or so after the blackout was as successful as it was. And it's a 501c4, so they're under no obligation to disclose their donors. So much for openness. Fight for the Future literally invented facts and repeatedly misrepresented the law's aims, saying the legislation would threaten Twitter or Facebook when mass distributors of unlicensed content based overseas, like the Pirate Bay, or formerly Mega Upload, were the clear targets. Ends justify the means paranoia baiting was the oxygen that fueled the successful blackout. So if meaningful enforcement is to happen, we can't run from SOPA or shy away from attacking the rhetoric that fueled it, much of which looks downright silly once the case is made that black markets were its target, not freedom fighters. If you don't like legislative prescriptions, Fred Wilson, who is the co-founder of Union Square Ventures, a venture capital firm in New York, certainly someone who understands technology, he suggested a voluntary model for a blacklist where an independent group would be deciding which sites deserve to be put on such a list, and there'd be a pop-up window where internet users would be warned this is a pirate site. Now he also admits, he says Google should do this, but they're not going to. So I would love it if there could be a non-legislative solution, but given the incentives that are built into this, I'm not terribly hopeful, but hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong. Anyway, obviously, if there is going to be some kind of a blacklist, the really difficult part is going to be determining standards for what constitutes a black market and figuring out where and how to draw the line. And that will be difficult. Let's go full circle here. The example of the Internet Radio Fairness Act was a really powerful one because artists really did drive the effort to kill that bill, and David did a hell of a lot of great work in pressuring Pandora on that front. But in terms of black markets, black lists, If we can find an agreeable solution that can be communicated to the public and give artists something they can stand before their fans and say they support, I actually feel it'd be possible to solve these issues fairly quickly. So success going forward to me means artists, labels, and legitimate services like Pandora and Spotify and Apple, iTunes, all pulling in the same direction. And I would say that, again, the formula for that is greater artist involvement from respected artists. Michael Gira from Swans, he's been very clear on being against piracy. So, that's the kind of voice that no serious music fan is going to argue with. So, now the great thing is that getting more people involved is something we can all do right now by signing the petition on brand-sponsored piracy. This is an important starting point to form a new coalition for a new paradigm, for a new internet. One where it isn't taken for granted with a wink and a nod that today's artists are destined to be ripped off. Thank you.